3 weeks ago, I was Dr. Vincent Kowalski, running a small eye clinic in Buffalo. Today, I'm recording this because you need to know what really happened during those first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. I'm not a soldier or a cop, just an optometrist who got trapped in his clinic when the dead started walking. My steady hands and attention to detail kept me alive when everyone else was dying. This is how I survived when the world ended. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dr. Vincent Kowalski, and I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. 3 weeks have passed since the zombie outbreak began, and I'm recording this message because there are lessons here that could save your life. I'm not a military man, not a police officer, not someone you'd typically expect to survive when the world falls apart. I was just an optometrist running a small eye clinic in Buffalo, New York. But I'm alive today, and there's a specific reason for that. You see, my entire career was built on paying attention to details that others miss. When you spend your days looking into people's eyes through high-powered magnification, examining the tiniest blood vessels and nerve patterns, you develop an almost obsessive focus on small things. That obsession, that need to see what others can't see, that's what kept me breathing when everyone else was dying around me. I want to start by telling you about October 15th, 2024. It was a Tuesday, and it began like any other day in my life. I've always been a creature of habit, something my ex-wife used to complain about constantly. Same morning routine, same breakfast, same drive to work. I'd wake up at 6:30, make my coffee black, no sugar, check the weather on my phone, and head to Kowalski Vision Care by 7:15. The clinic wasn't much to look at from the outside. A single-story brick building in a strip mall on Elmwood Avenue, wedged between a dry cleaner and a small grocery store. I'd been there for 8 years, ever since I finished my residency, and decided I wanted to help people in my own neighborhood instead of working for some corporate chain. Most of my patients were working-class folks, kids who needed their first pair of glasses, elderly people dealing with cataracts. Nothing glamorous, but it was honest work. That morning, the news was full of reports about what they were calling a severe flu outbreak in Rochester. The anchors kept using words like unprecedented and highly contagious. But honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. We get flu scares every few years, and they usually turn out to be nothing more than media hysteria. I was more concerned about my backup generator, which had been making strange grinding noises for the past week. I kept telling myself I needed to get down to the basement and take a look at it, but like most things that aren't immediately urgent, I kept putting it off. My first patient that day was supposed to be Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd been coming to me for glaucoma treatment for the past 3 years. She had an appointment at 8:30 for her regular pressure check, but she never showed up. That should have been my first warning sign. Mrs. Chen was the most punctual person I'd ever met. In 3 years, she'd never been more than 5 minutes early or late. When 8:45 rolled around and she still wasn't there, I called her house. The phone rang and rang, but nobody answered. I had 2 more patients that morning, both routine eye exams. The first was a teenager named Marcus, whose mother thought he needed glasses because his grades were slipping. Turned out his vision was perfect, which meant his problems were probably more about motivation than eyesight. The second was an insurance adjuster who needed new contact lenses. Normal stuff, everyday stuff. The kind of interactions that made up 90% of my professional life. But even during those appointments, I kept hearing things on my radio that made me uncomfortable. I always kept a small radio playing quietly in the background, tuned to the local news station. Usually it was just traffic reports and weather updates, but that morning the reports from Rochester were getting more detailed and more disturbing. They were talking about people becoming extremely aggressive and unresponsive to medical treatment. They mentioned that several hospitals in the Rochester area were requesting emergency assistance from the National Guard. I have to admit, part of me was skeptical about the whole thing. I'd been a ham radio operator for about 10 years, ever since my divorce gave me too much time on my hands and I needed a hobby. My call sign is KD to VKW, and I'd spent countless evenings talking to other operators across the state and beyond. In the amateur radio community, we hear about emergencies long before they hit the mainstream news, and we also hear about a lot of false alarms. So when the official news started sounding panicked, my first instinct was to think they were overreacting. But the thing about being in the medical field, even just eye care, is that you develop an instinct for when something is seriously wrong. And that Tuesday morning, something felt off. It wasn't just the news reports or Mrs. Chen's absence. It was smaller things. The streets seemed quieter than usual. I noticed that the grocery store next door, which normally had a steady stream of customers all morning, looked practically empty. The dry cleaners sign said they were open, but I hadn't seen anyone go in or out all day. Around 11:30, I decided to take a break and check in with some of my fellow ham radio operators. I keep my radio equipment in the basement of the clinic, partly for better signal reception, and partly because the basement stays cooler, which is better for the electronics. It's not a fancy setup, just a basic transceiver and antenna system, but it's reliable and it lets me talk to people hundreds of miles away when conditions are right. I turned on the radio and immediately heard chatter that made my blood run cold. Operators in Rochester were describing scenes that sounded like something out of a horror movie. People attacking each other in the streets, emergency services overwhelmed, entire neighborhoods going silent. One operator, a guy I'd talked to many times before, was transmitting from his house near the university. His voice was shaking as he described watching his neighbor try to bite chunks out of a mail carrier. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of hoax or mass hysteria. People see one crazy thing happen, and suddenly everyone starts imagining they're seeing the same thing. But as I listened longer, the reports were coming from too many different sources, too many different locations. These weren't copycat stories or people jumping on a bandwagon. These were experienced radio operators, people I'd known for years, describing things they were witnessing with their own eyes. One transmission particularly stuck with me. An operator in Brockport, about halfway between Rochester and Buffalo, was trying to coordinate with emergency services. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. You have to destroy the brain. Shooting them in the chest doesn't work. You have to destroy the brain. At the time, I thought he was having some kind of mental breakdown. Looking back, he was probably the first person trying to save lives by sharing information that could keep people alive. I stayed in the basement listening to the radio until almost 1 o'clock. My lunch appointment had been canceled that morning, so I had time to really pay attention to what was happening. The picture that emerged was terrifying. Rochester wasn't just dealing with some kind of flu outbreak or mass poisoning. People were dying and then getting back up. They were attacking anyone they could reach, biting them, tearing at them with their fingers and teeth. And according to multiple witnesses, the only way to stop them was to cause severe brain damage. When I finally came back upstairs, I tried to process what I'd heard. Part of me still wanted to believe it was all some kind of mistake or exaggeration. But I've always been a methodical person, someone who looks at evidence and draws logical conclusions. The evidence was pointing towards something unprecedented and dangerous moving in our direction. That's when the power went out. It happened at exactly 1:47 in the afternoon. I remember the time so precisely because I was looking at the digital clock on my appointment scheduling computer when the screen went black. The lights went out, the air conditioning stopped humming, and suddenly my clinic was filled with an eerie quiet that I'd never experienced during business hours. My first thought was that it was probably just a routine power outage. Buffalo gets them fairly regularly, especially during storms or when the grid gets overloaded during extreme weather. But there hadn't been any storms that day, and the weather was mild for October. I looked out the window and could see that the traffic lights at the intersection were also dark. This wasn't just my building, it was the whole area. I tried my cell phone to call the power company, but I couldn't get a signal. That was unusual but not unheard of. Sometimes when the power grid goes down, it affects cell towers too. But when I tried the landline in my office, that was dead as well. No dial tone, no nothing. That combination of power outage, dead cell service, and dead landlines was something I'd never experienced before. That's when I remembered the generator in the basement. I'd been putting off fixing it for over a week, but suddenly it seemed like the most important thing in the world. If I could get it running, I'd have power for my radio equipment and maybe some lights. More importantly, I'd be able to maintain contact with the outside world and figure out what was really happening. The generator was an old unit that came with the building when I bought the practice. It was supposed to provide emergency power for essential systems, but like I said, it had been making concerning noises lately. When I got down to the basement and pulled the cover off, I could see the problem immediately. The cooling fan had a cracked blade, and there was oil leaking from what looked like a gasket around the engine block. I'm not a mechanic by training, but I've always been good with my hands. You have to be, in my line of work. Eye care requires incredibly precise movements and the ability to manipulate delicate instruments. So I figured I could at least attempt some basic repairs and see if I could get the generator running temporarily. While I was working on the engine, my ham radio was still on and scanning for transmissions. What I heard during that hour in the basement changed everything for me. The reports from Rochester had gotten much worse. Entire city blocks were going silent. Emergency services had stopped responding to most calls. And the infection, or whatever it was spreading outward from the city center at an alarming rate. But the most chilling thing I heard was a transmission from an operator in Batavia, which is only about 40 miles east of Buffalo. He was describing the same scenes that Rochester operators had been reporting earlier in the day. People attacking each other, victims getting back up after being killed, emergency services collapsing. The timeline suggested that whatever was happening was moving westward along the major highways, and it was moving fast. I worked on that generator for almost 2 hours, and by the time I got it running, the sun was starting to get lower in the sky. It was probably around 3:30 when I finally got some power back to the building. The first thing I did was check my radio equipment to make sure everything was working. The second thing I did was try to call someone, anyone, to find out what was happening in the wider world. That's when I climbed back upstairs and saw something that changed my life forever. Through the large front window of my clinic, I could see the parking lot clearly. It's not a big lot, maybe 20 spaces, shared between my clinic and the other businesses in the strip mall. On a normal afternoon, there might be 4 or 5 cars parked there. That day, there were only 2. One belonged to Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who came to me twice a year for basic vision checks. She was in her 70s, lived alone since her husband Earl had retired from the steel plant. They were nice people, the kind of patients who always paid their bills on time and sent me Christmas cards every year. Mrs. Patterson was running across the parking lot and she was screaming. I'd never heard an elderly woman make sounds like that. It wasn't just fear or pain, it was pure terror, the kind of sound that goes straight to your bones and makes every instinct in your body scream that something is horribly wrong. Her gray hair was wild, her floral dress was torn at the shoulder, and she was running with the kind of desperate energy that people only have when they're running for their lives. Behind her, maybe 20 feet back, was Earl. Except it wasn't Earl, not really. I knew Earl Patterson well enough to recognize him, but something was fundamentally wrong with the way he looked and moved. His skin had turned a grayish color, almost like old newspaper. Dark veins were visible under the surface, creating patterns I'd never seen on a living person. His clothes were torn and stained with what looked like blood, both fresh and dried. But it was his face that really got to me. His mouth was hanging open and I could see his teeth were covered in blood. His eyes were still there, but they looked empty, like there was nobody home behind them. And the way he moved, it was all wrong. He wasn't running so much as stumbling forward with purpose, like someone who'd forgotten how their legs were supposed to work, but was determined to keep moving anyway. I grabbed my optometry loupes from the exam room and put them on to get a better look. These are essentially small telescopes that I wear during detailed eye examinations, and they magnify everything by about 3.5 times. With them on, I could see details that would have been invisible to the naked eye at that distance. What I saw through those loupes is burned into my memory forever. Earl's fingernails were broken and bloody, like he'd been clawing at something hard. There were bite marks on his neck and arms, wounds that looked fresh but weren't bleeding the way they should have been. And his mouth, when it opened wider as he got closer to Mrs. Patterson, I could see that his tongue was a dark, almost black color. Mrs. Patterson reached her car and fumbled with her keys, but Earl was closing the distance fast. She got the driver's door open just as he reached her, and what happened next was the most horrifying thing I'd ever witnessed in my life. Earl grabbed Mrs. Patterson by her shoulders and pulled her away from the car. She fell backward onto the asphalt, and he fell on top of her, pinning her down with his body weight. Then he lowered his head toward her neck, and I realized with growing horror that he was biting her. Not just biting, but tearing, ripping chunks of flesh away and swallowing them while she thrashed beneath him. Mrs. Patterson's screams changed in pitch and volume, becoming wet and gurgling as blood filled her throat. I watched through my magnifying loupes as Earl methodically ate pieces of a woman I'd known for years, a woman who'd brought me homemade cookies every Christmas. I should have done something. I should have called the police, or grabbed something to use as a weapon, or at least opened the window and shouted to try to distract Earl. But I was frozen, completely paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. This wasn't something that happened in real life. This was something from movies or nightmares, not from a Tuesday afternoon in Buffalo. Mrs. Patterson's struggles got weaker and weaker and finally stopped altogether. Earl kept feeding for another few minutes, then sat back on his heels and looked around with that empty expression. That's when I snapped out of my shock long enough to duck below the window ledge, terrified that he might see me and decide to come after me next. I crouched there behind my reception desk for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside again, Earl was gone. Mrs. Patterson was still lying next to her car, and even from inside the building, I could see that she was dead. No, nobody loses that much blood and survives. I tried calling 911 on my cell phone, but still couldn't get a signal. The landline was still dead. I tried the direct number for the Buffalo Police Department that I had written on a card in my wallet, but that line just rang busy. I tried the fire department, the sheriff's office, even the non-emergency line for City Hall. Everything was either busy or not working at all. That's when I went back to the basement and started seriously listening to the ham radio traffic. What I heard confirmed my worst fears. Buffalo was starting to experience the same breakdown that had hit Rochester earlier in the day. Emergency services were overwhelmed, communication systems were failing, and people were reporting the same impossible scenes I'd just witnessed in my own parking lot. One operator was transmitting from somewhere near the airport. He said the highways heading out of the city were completely jammed with people trying to evacuate, but that traffic had come to a complete standstill. Another operator reported that the bridges over the Niagara River were blocked by military checkpoints, and that nobody was being allowed to cross into Canada. But the transmission that really got my attention came from an operator who identified himself as being at Buffalo General Hospital. His call sign was KD2SMD, and his voice had the kind of calm professionalism that made me think he might be medical personnel. He was trying to coordinate with other operators to establish an emergency communication network, but he also shared some information that made my blood run cold. He said the hospital had been receiving bite victims all day, starting around 10 in the morning. At first, they treated them as standard trauma cases, but then something unprecedented began happening. Patients who had been declared dead were getting back up, not recovering, not responding to resuscitation efforts, but actually getting up and walking around. And when they got up, they were attacking anyone within reach. The hospital had gone into lockdown around 2 in the afternoon, but they were running low on security personnel and medical supplies. He estimated they had maybe 6 hours before the situation became completely untenable. Then his transmission cut off abruptly, and I never heard from KD2 SMD again. By this time, the sun was getting low in the sky, and I realized I needed to make some decisions fast. I could try to get to my car and attempt to evacuate like everyone else, but from what I was hearing on the radio, the roads were impassable, and the authorities weren't letting people leave the area anyway. I could try to get home to my apartment, but that would mean traveling several miles through a city that was apparently falling apart. Or I could stay in my clinic, which was built like a fortress compared to most buildings, and try to wait out whatever was happening until help arrived. I chose to stay, and that decision probably saved my life. But as I was making that choice, something happened that convinced me I was dealing with something far beyond a normal emergency situation. I looked out the front window one more time to check the parking lot, and I saw Mrs. Patterson standing next to her car. She was standing upright, moving with the same awkward, stumbling gait I'd seen from Earl earlier. Her neck was a mess of torn flesh and dried blood, but she was walking around like the massive trauma didn't matter. When she turned toward my building, I could see that her eyes had the same empty expression Earl's had, and her mouth was hanging open the same way. That's when I understood that the world I'd known my entire life was already dead, and I was going to have to learn how to survive in whatever was taking its place. The moment I saw Mrs. Patterson standing up with half her neck missing, I knew I was dealing with something that defied every medical principle I'd ever learned. Dead people don't get back up. Dead people don't walk around. But there she was, moving toward my clinic with that same shambling gait I'd seen from Earl, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about life and death had just become irrelevant. My first instinct was to get away from the windows. I dropped to my hands and knees behind the reception desk and crawled toward the back of the clinic, trying to stay below the sight line of anyone or anything outside. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely control them. This wasn't the steady-handed precision I was used to. This was raw terror. I needed to think systematically, the way I approached complex medical cases. Step 1 was securing my immediate safety. Step 2 was gathering information. Step 3 was making a plan based on that information. It was the same process I used when diagnosing difficult vision problems, just applied to staying alive instead of improving someone's eyesight. My clinic wasn't designed to be a fortress, but it had some advantages I'd never thought about before. The front windows were large, which was bad for defense, but they were also reinforced safety glass because of insurance requirements. The back wall was solid brick with no windows at all. The side walls had small windows, but they were high up and would be difficult for someone to climb through. The front door was solid wood with a good deadbolt lock, and there was a back door that led to an alley, but it was steel and had 2 separate locks. I started by checking all the locks and making sure they were secure. Then I began moving furniture to reinforce the most vulnerable points. My examination chairs were heavy and mounted on wheeled bases, so I could position them in front of the main windows as barriers. My desk was solid wood and probably weighed 200 pounds, so I dragged it in front of the front door. It wasn't perfect, but it would slow down anyone trying to get in. While I was barricading, I kept thinking about what I'd seen outside. Mrs. Patterson had moved like someone with severe neurological damage, but she'd been able to walk and maintain balance. Earl had shown enough coordination to chase and catch his victim. Whatever was wrong with them, it wasn't random. There was some kind of purpose behind their actions, even if that purpose was alien to anything I understood. I also kept thinking about the bite marks I'd seen on Earl through my optometry loupes. They looked fresh but weren't bleeding properly, which suggested his circulatory system had shut down. But if his heart wasn't pumping blood, how was he still moving? And how had Mrs. Patterson gotten back up after losing that much blood from her neck wound? These weren't academic questions anymore. Understanding how these things worked might be the difference between living and dying. So I started treating it like a medical mystery, documenting everything I observed and looking for patterns that might help me predict their behavior. The first thing I noticed was that both Earl and Mrs. Patterson had moved toward the sounds of activity. Earl had chased Mrs. Patterson when she was running and screaming. Mrs. Patterson had turned toward my clinic when I was moving around inside and probably making noise with the furniture. That suggested they were attracted to sound, which meant I needed to be as quiet as possible. The second thing was that they both seemed to have lost most of their higher brain functions but retained basic motor skills. They could walk, grab things, and bite, but they didn't show any sign of problem-solving or complex reasoning. That was both good and bad news. Good because it meant they probably couldn't figure out how to get past my barricades. Bad because it meant they wouldn't get bored and wander away if they couldn't immediately reach me. Once I had the clinic as secure as I could make it with the resources available, I went back to the basement to monitor the ham radio traffic. What I heard over the next few hours painted a picture of a city in complete collapse. Buffalo was experiencing the same breakdown that had hit Rochester, but we were getting it all compressed into a much shorter time frame. The National Weather Service emergency broadcast system was repeating a message telling people to stay indoors and avoid contact with anyone showing signs of unusual aggression or illness. They weren't using the word zombie yet, but they were describing the same symptoms I'd witnessed firsthand. The message also said that emergency services were suspended until further notice, which meant I was completely on my own. Ham radio operators across western New York were sharing information and trying to coordinate some kind of response network. I learned that the outbreak seemed to be spreading along major highways, probably carried by people fleeing from infected areas. The incubation period appeared to be very short, maybe just a few hours from bite to death to reanimation. And most importantly, the only reliable way to stop them was severe trauma to the brain. One operator in Tonawanda, just north of Buffalo, had figured out some basic survival rules that he was sharing with anyone who would listen. Stay quiet to avoid attracting attention. Barricade yourself in a secure location with multiple exit routes. Don't trust anyone who's been bitten, even if they seem fine. And if you have to fight, aim for the head and make sure they stay down. I also made contact with that operator from Buffalo General Hospital I'd heard earlier, KD2 SMD. His name was Dr. Sarah Martinez, and she was an emergency room physician who'd been trapped in the hospital when they went into lockdown. She confirmed what I'd suspected about the medical aspects of the outbreak. The infected showed no vital signs that would normally indicate life, but they remained mobile and aggressive. Standard medical interventions like CPR, drugs, or surgery had no effect on them. The only thing that stopped them was destruction of brain tissue. Dr. Martinez also shared some information that was both helpful and terrifying. She'd observed that the infected seemed to retain some muscle memory from their previous lives. A former construction worker had used a hammer effectively, even in his reanimated state. A nurse had tried to use medical equipment, though without the cognitive ability to use it properly. This suggested that I might be dealing with enemies who retained some of the physical skills they'd had when they were alive. But she also told me something that gave me hope. The infected appeared to be gradually deteriorating. Their motor functions became less coordinated over time, and they moved more slowly as hours passed. This wasn't like the movies where zombies stayed at peak physical condition indefinitely. They were breaking down, which meant that if I could survive long enough, they might become less dangerous. As evening approached, I started hearing more activity outside my clinic. Not just individual infected people, but groups of them. Through my small side windows, I could see shadows moving past the building. Sometimes they seemed to be following each other, like they were drawn to the same stimuli. Other times they appeared to be wandering randomly. I realized that I needed better intelligence about what was happening outside, so I improvised a periscope using a dental mirror mounted on a telescoping handle. Dental mirrors are small and highly reflective, and I had several different sizes in my instrument collection. By angling one properly, I could see around corners or over obstacles without exposing myself to direct observation. Using this makeshift periscope, I discovered that the parking lot outside my clinic had become a gathering point for infected individuals. I counted at least 8 of them wandering around the area, including Earl and Mrs. Patterson. They didn't seem to be actively hunting, but they weren't leaving either. It was like they were drawn to the area by some stimulus I couldn't identify. That's when I realized that my generator might be the problem. It was running in the basement, providing power for my lights and radio equipment, but it was also making a low humming noise that could probably be heard outside the building. To creatures that were attracted to sound, that steady mechanical noise might be like a beacon drawing them to my location. I had to make a choice. I could shut down the generator and lose power for my radio equipment, which was my only connection to the outside world and my source of vital information. Or I could keep it running and accept that I was probably attracting every infected person in the neighborhood to my building. I decided to keep the generator running for now, but I knew that decision was going to create problems later. Meanwhile, I used my radio time to gather as much intelligence as possible about what was happening in the wider area. The news from other parts of the state was universally bad. Rochester was completely silent on the radio networks, which suggested that either everyone there was dead or all the radio operators had been forced to abandon their equipment. Syracuse was starting to report the same problems Buffalo was experiencing. Albany was still functioning, but they were preparing for the worst. More disturbing were the reports from major cities outside New York. Philadelphia had gone dark around noon. Pittsburgh was calling for federal assistance. Detroit was reporting that the infection had crossed over from Canada, which meant the international border wasn't providing any protection. But there were also some encouraging reports. Rural areas seemed to be largely unaffected, probably because the infection spread through human contact, and rural populations were more spread out. Some small towns had successfully quarantined themselves by blocking roads and screening everyone who tried to enter. And the military was starting to establish safe zones in areas that hadn't been overrun yet. The problem was getting to those safe zones. Every route out of Buffalo was either blocked by traffic jams or controlled by infected populations that had spread out from the city center. Even if I could get to my car, I probably wouldn't be able to drive more than a few miles before running into impassable obstacles. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, I had my first serious close call with the infected. I was monitoring radio traffic in the basement when I heard scraping sounds coming from directly above my head. Something was moving around on the main floor of my clinic, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. I turned down the radio volume and listened carefully. The sounds were coming from the reception area, near the front of the building. It sounded like someone was pushing against the furniture I'd used to barricade the windows, testing whether it would move. Then I heard a different sound, like fingernails or claws scraping against glass. I realized that one or more of the infected had gotten close enough to my building to start testing my defenses. They might not be capable of complex problem solving, but they were persistent enough to keep trying different approaches until they found a weakness. Moving as quietly as possible, I climbed the basement stairs and peered through the crack under the door that led to the main floor. I could see shadows moving past the gap, backlit by the emergency lighting I'd set up in the front windows. There were definitely multiple figures out there, and they were actively trying to find a way into the building. The scraping sounds continued for almost an hour, sometimes from the front windows, sometimes from the sides. At one point, I heard what sounded like someone trying to turn the handle on the front door, though the deadbolt held firm. Another time, there were impacts against the back door, like someone was pushing or hitting it repeatedly. But the most frightening moment came when I heard footsteps directly overhead. Something had gotten onto the roof of my building and was walking around up there. I'd completely forgotten that there was roof access through a maintenance hatch in the basement ceiling. If the infected figured out how to get down through that hatch, my basement refuge would become a trap. I spent the rest of the evening moving supplies and equipment away from the area directly below the roof access. I also found a heavy wrench that I could use as a weapon if necessary, though I hoped it wouldn't come to that. My hands are trained for precision work, not violence, and I wasn't sure I'd be effective in hand-to-hand combat even against opponents with limited motor skills. The activity outside gradually died down as the night progressed, but it never stopped completely. There was always at least one infected person moving around the building, testing different approaches or just wandering randomly. I realized that as long as my generator kept running, I was going to have this problem. The noise was drawing them to me like moths to a flame. Around 11 o'clock, I made radio contact with a group of survivors who'd barricaded themselves in a sporting goods store about 3 miles away. Their leader was a former military police officer named Staff Sergeant Williams, and he'd organized about a dozen people into a defensive position with plenty of weapons and supplies. He was trying to coordinate with other survivor groups to establish supply lines and evacuation routes. Staff Sergeant Williams confirmed something I'd suspected based on my own observations. The infected were more active at night. They seemed drawn to artificial light sources, probably because those indicated the presence of living people. He also said that they appeared to be gradually spreading outward from the original infection sites, following major roads and population centers. His group had established communication with military units that were setting up a safe zone near the Canadian border. But getting there would require traveling through areas that were heavily infested with the infected. They were planning to attempt the journey in a few days, once they'd gathered enough vehicles and weapons to fight their way through. Staff Sergeant Williams also shared some tactical information that turned out to be incredibly valuable. The infected could be distracted by loud noises or bright lights, which could be used to draw them away from your actual location. They had difficulty with obstacles like stairs or narrow passages, which suggested that their motor skills were more limited than they initially appeared. And they seemed to lose interest in targets they couldn't reach after a certain period of time, though that period could be several hours. As midnight approached, I had to make another difficult decision. My radio equipment was draining the generator's fuel supply faster than I'd expected, and I estimated that I had maybe 12 more hours of power remaining. I could conserve fuel by shutting down non-essential systems, but that would mean losing my lights and some of my communication capability. I decided to switch to emergency power mode, keeping only the radio equipment and one small light running. This reduced the noise signature of my generator significantly, and over the next few hours, I noticed that the infected activity outside my building decreased. They were still in the area, but they weren't actively trying to get into my clinic anymore. That gave me time to conduct a more thorough inventory of my supplies and plan for the challenges ahead. I had enough food for maybe 3 more days if I was careful, and enough water for about the same period. My medical supplies were limited to basic first aid equipment and the specialized medications I used for eye care, though some of those might have applications I hadn't considered yet. More importantly, I had access to tools and materials that most people wouldn't think of as survival equipment. My clinic was full of precision instruments, optical devices, and electronic equipment that could potentially be adapted for other uses. I had several different types of magnifying lenses, precision tools for handling delicate components, and enough spare parts to build or repair basic electronic devices. I also had something that was turning out to be incredibly valuable in this new world: the ability to see fine details that others might miss. My professional training had taught me to notice subtle changes in tissue coloration, blood vessel patterns, and nerve responses that could indicate serious medical problems. Those same observational skills were helping me spot early signs of infection, predict infected behavior patterns, and identify potential escape routes or resources. As I sat in my basement refuge, listening to the sporadic radio chatter from other survivors across the region, I started to understand that this outbreak wasn't going to be a short-term emergency. The infection was spreading too fast and affecting too large an area for normal emergency response systems to handle it. We weren't looking at days or weeks of disruption. We were looking at the complete collapse of civilization as we'd known it. But I also realized that my particular combination of skills and resources might make me more valuable to other survivors than I'd initially thought. My medical knowledge, my radio communication abilities, my access to specialized tools, and my methodical approach to problem solving could all contribute to a survival group's chances of long-term success. The question was whether I could survive long enough to connect with other survivors and put those skills to use. My clinic had provided good protection for the first night, but I was burning through supplies quickly, and the infected population outside seemed to be growing rather than diminishing. I needed to start thinking beyond just hiding and hoping for rescue. I needed to start planning for the possibility that I might have to leave my refuge and venture out into a world that had become fundamentally hostile to human life. As dawn approached and the infected activity outside reached its lowest point of the night, I began preparing for that possibility. I identified the most essential items I'd need to take with me: radio equipment, medical supplies, precision tools, and a few optical devices that might prove useful. I also started thinking about routes I could take to reach other survivor groups or potential safe zones. But first, I had to get through day 2. And based on what I'd observed during the night, day 2 was going to present challenges that would make my first day look easy by comparison. When morning light started filtering through my clinic windows on day 2, I realized that my situation had changed dramatically overnight. The infected weren't just wandering randomly anymore. They were gathering in larger groups, and those groups seemed to be developing some kind of primitive coordination. Through my improvised periscope system, I could see at least 15 of them in the immediate area around my building, and they were moving in patterns that suggested they were responding to each other's actions. This was a development that terrified me more than anything I'd witnessed the previous day. Individual infected people were dangerous but predictable. Groups of them working together, even at a basic level, represented a threat I wasn't equipped to handle. My barricades and hiding spots were designed to protect me from random encounters, not from coordinated attempts to breach my defenses. I spent the first few hours of daylight conducting a more systematic assessment of my resources and my situation. The generator had been running for almost 18 hours straight, and the fuel gauge showed I was down to about 1/4 capacity. At the current consumption rate, I estimated I had maybe 8 more hours of power remaining. After that, I'd lose my radio communication, my lights, and my ability to operate any electrical equipment. My food situation was also becoming critical. I'd brought lunch to work the previous day, but that was long gone. I'd found a small stash of granola bars and bottled water in the break room, but that wouldn't last more than another day or two. I'd been so focused on the immediate threat of the infected that I hadn't properly planned for basic survival needs like food and water. But as I was conducting this inventory, I made a discovery that changed my perspective on what resources were actually available to me. In a supply cabinet I rarely used, I found a collection of medications that I'd almost forgotten about. Most of them were standard eye care drugs like antibiotic drops and anti-inflammatory solutions. But there were also some medications that could have broader medical applications. More importantly, I realized that my understanding of pharmacology and human physiology, even specialized for eye care, was more extensive than I'd initially appreciated. I knew how different drugs affected blood flow, nerve function, and tissue response. I understood how infections spread through the body and how the immune system responded to various threats. This knowledge might not make me a general physician, but it certainly made me more medically capable than the average person. I also started looking at my optical equipment with fresh eyes, thinking about how these precision instruments might be adapted for survival purposes. My slit lamp microscope, which I used for detailed eye examinations, was essentially a high-powered magnifying system with excellent lighting. It could be used to examine small objects in great detail, which might be useful for identifying edible plants, detecting contamination in water sources, or examining wounds for signs of infection. My trial lens kit, which contained hundreds of different optical lenses for vision testing, could potentially be used to build telescopes, microscopes, or signal mirrors. My various measuring instruments could help with navigation or construction projects. Even my patient chairs, which were designed to be precisely adjustable, could be converted into other types of equipment if necessary. But the real game changer was my ham radio setup. Over the past day and night, I'd been monitoring communications from survivor groups across the region, and I was starting to understand the bigger picture of what was happening. Buffalo wasn't an isolated incident. The outbreak had spread across most of the northeastern United States and was continuing to expand. Traditional emergency services had collapsed in most affected areas, but networks of amateur radio operators were maintaining communication and coordination between scattered survivor groups. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, I made contact with a group that particularly caught my attention. They were holed up in a pharmacy about 6 blocks from my clinic, and their situation was both similar to mine and dramatically different. Like me, they'd found themselves trapped when the outbreak began and had been forced to improvise defenses using whatever materials were available. Unlike me, they had access to a much wider range of medical supplies, including antibiotics, painkillers, and other drugs that could be crucial for treating injuries or illnesses. The group was led by a woman named Jennifer Santos, who'd been working as a pharmacy technician when the outbreak began. She'd managed to gather 4 other people who'd been in the area when the crisis started: a retired electrician, a college student, a restaurant cook, and a city bus driver. None of them had military or law enforcement experience, but they'd managed to survive by being careful, quiet, and smart about resource management. Jennifer told me that their main problem was water. The pharmacy had plenty of medical supplies and some food, but the building's water system had failed when the power grid went down. They'd been rationing bottled water for 2 days, but they were down to maybe a 12-hour supply. Without a reliable source of clean water, they'd have to abandon their secure position and venture out into infected territory to find more. That's when I realized I might have something valuable to offer. My knowledge of optics could be used to build a solar still, a device that uses sunlight and condensation to purify contaminated water or extract moisture from the air. It wouldn't produce large quantities of water quickly, but it could provide a sustainable source of clean drinking water as long as there was sunlight available. I explained the concept to Jennifer over the radio, and she immediately understood the implications. If I could help them solve their water problem, they could stay in their secure location indefinitely. In return, they could provide me with access to medical supplies that might be crucial if I got injured or sick. They also had more people available for watch duties, defense, and resource gathering. But there was a significant problem with this plan. I was 6 blocks away from their location, and those 6 blocks were crawling with infected people. Getting from my clinic to their pharmacy would require traveling through some of the most dangerous territory in the city. Even if I could make the journey safely, I'd be abandoning my own secure position and taking a huge risk for people I'd never met. I spent several hours weighing this decision, and during that time, two things happened that helped clarify my thinking. First, my generator started showing signs of more serious mechanical problems. The cooling system was overheating, and I could smell burning oil coming from the basement. Even if I had enough fuel to keep it running, the engine itself might fail at any moment. When that happened, I'd lose all electrical power and would be forced to operate in complete darkness once the sun went down. Second, I established radio contact with my brother Michael in Chicago. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years, not since our argument about how I'd handled my divorce and my decision to stay in Buffalo instead of moving somewhere with better career opportunities. But when he heard my call sign on the emergency frequency, he immediately responded. Michael told me that Chicago was still relatively unaffected by the outbreak, but they were receiving refugees from the affected areas, and the situation was changing rapidly. More importantly, he'd been monitoring news reports and government communications about the crisis. According to federal authorities, the infection was spreading much faster than anyone had initially predicted, and the military response was being overwhelmed. The official government position was that affected areas should be quarantined until a treatment or cure could be developed. But Michael had heard unofficial reports suggesting that some officials were advocating for much more drastic measures. There was talk of using tactical nuclear weapons to sterilize the most heavily infected zones, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of people to prevent the outbreak from spreading nationwide. Michael urged me to get out of Buffalo immediately and head toward the Canadian border, where international relief organizations were supposedly setting up refugee camps. He promised to do everything he could to help me get to Chicago once I reached safety, but he was absolutely clear that staying in the city was not a viable long-term option. This conversation with my brother forced me to confront a reality I'd been avoiding. My clinic wasn't a permanent refuge, it was a temporary shelter. Eventually, I'd have to leave Buffalo, and when I did, I'd need allies, supplies, and a plan for getting to safety. Connecting with Jennifer's group might be my best opportunity to assemble those resources. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I made my decision. I would attempt to reach the pharmacy and link up with the other survivors. But I wasn't going to rush into this blindly. I was going to approach it the same way I approached complex medical procedures, with careful planning, systematic preparation, and multiple backup options. First, I used my radio equipment to establish detailed communication protocols with Jennifer's group. We agreed on specific times for check-in calls, emergency signals, and backup frequencies in case our primary channel was compromised. I also gathered as much information as possible about the route I'd need to take, the types of obstacles I might encounter, and the resources that would be available at their location. Next, I began preparing the equipment I'd need for the journey. I couldn't carry much, so every item had to serve multiple purposes. My most essential piece of equipment was a portable ham radio that would allow me to maintain communication with other survivor groups. I also packed a small selection of precision tools, some basic medical supplies, and several optical devices that I thought might prove useful. But the most important part of my preparation was creating a detailed plan for building the solar still once I reached the pharmacy. I used my knowledge of optics and thermodynamics to design a system that could be constructed using materials that were likely to be available in a commercial building. The basic principle was simple: use focused sunlight to heat contaminated water, capture the resulting water vapor, and condense it back into clean liquid water. The key components would be a clear plastic or glass surface to create a greenhouse effect, a dark-colored container to absorb heat and hold the contaminated water, and a collection system to gather the condensed water vapor. I could use lenses from my trial lens kit to focus additional sunlight onto the heating element, significantly increasing the efficiency of the evaporation process. I spent several hours working out the technical details and creating diagrams that I could use to explain the construction process to people who didn't have my background in optics. This wasn't just about helping Jennifer's group. It was about creating a sustainable survival technology that could be replicated by other survivors facing similar challenges. By late afternoon, my generator was showing serious signs of failure. The engine was running rough, the cooling system was barely functional, and the electrical output was becoming increasingly unstable. I estimated that I had maybe 2 more hours of reliable power, after which I'd be operating on battery backup for my radio equipment. This mechanical failure forced me to accelerate my timeline. I'd planned to wait until evening when infected activity typically decreased, but I couldn't afford to wait that long. If my radio failed before I established contact with Jennifer's group, I'd lose my ability to coordinate the rescue operation and might end up wandering through infected territory with no way to call for help. I made one final radio contact with Jennifer to confirm our rendezvous plan, then began my preparations for leaving the clinic. I packed my essential equipment into a lightweight backpack, leaving behind everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. I also prepared several distraction devices using materials from my clinic, small electronic devices that would make noise and light to draw infected attention away from my actual location. Before leaving the basement, I took one last look around the space that had been my refuge for the past day and a half. It wasn't much to look at, just a small room filled with mechanical equipment and radio gear, but it had kept me alive during the most dangerous period of my life. I felt a strange sense of gratitude toward this unremarkable space, even as I prepared to abandon it forever. The final step in my preparation was creating a detailed route plan based on everything I'd observed about infected behavior patterns. I knew they were attracted to sound and movement, but they also seemed to follow established paths like roads and sidewalks. By staying off the main routes and moving through areas with plenty of cover, I might be able to avoid the largest concentrations of infected individuals. I also planned several contingency routes in case my primary path was blocked or compromised. Each route took advantage of different types of terrain and offered different options for concealment or escape. This kind of systematic planning was second nature to me from my medical training, where having multiple treatment options was often the difference between success and failure. As I prepared to leave my clinic and venture into the infected wasteland that Buffalo had become, I realized that this decision represented more than just a change of location. I was transitioning from passive survival to active engagement with the new reality. Instead of just hiding and hoping for rescue, I was taking control of my own fate and working to build connections with other survivors. The next few hours would determine whether that transition was a brilliant strategic move or a fatal mistake. But either way, I was done being a victim of circumstances. I was ready to start fighting back against the apocalypse that had destroyed my world. The moment I opened the back door of my clinic and stepped into the alley, I understood that everything I thought I knew about the infected was incomplete. The air itself felt different, thick with an odor I'd never encountered before. It wasn't just decay or death, it was something more complex and disturbing. The smell had layers to it, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic and sharp. Later, I would learn that this was the distinctive scent of the infection itself, something that marked infected territory as clearly as any visible sign. My plan was to move through the alley system behind the commercial buildings, avoiding the main streets where I'd observed the highest concentrations of infected individuals. The alleys offered better cover and fewer sight lines, which would make it harder for the infected to spot me from a distance. I'd also observed that infected people seemed to prefer open spaces where they could move freely, so the narrow confines of the alleys might naturally have fewer of them. The first 100 yards went smoothly. I moved slowly and carefully, stopping frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate infected presence. My optometry training had taught me to be incredibly patient and methodical, qualities that were serving me well in this new environment. Every few steps, I would pause and use my small dental mirror to check around corners and behind obstacles before exposing myself to potential threats. It was during one of these reconnaissance stops that I encountered my first infected person since leaving the clinic. I was crouched behind a dumpster, using my mirror to examine the path ahead, when I saw movement in the reflection. An infected woman was wandering through the alley about 50 feet behind me, moving in my general direction but not with any apparent awareness of my presence. Through my mirror, I could observe her behavior without turning around or making any sudden movements that might attract her attention. She was middle-aged, probably in her 40s, wearing what had once been a business suit but was now torn and stained with blood and other substances I didn't want to identify. Her movement pattern was exactly what I'd observed from other infected individuals, a shambling, unsteady gait that suggested significant neurological impairment. But what struck me most was how she was navigating the alley. She wasn't moving randomly or bumping into obstacles the way I'd expected. Instead, she seemed to be following some kind of path or routine, like she was retracing steps she'd taken many times before. This suggested that the infected might retain some kind of spatial memory or behavioral patterns from their previous lives, which could make their movements more predictable, but also potentially more dangerous. I waited motionless behind the dumpster for almost 20 minutes while she gradually moved past my position and continued down the alley. Only when I was absolutely certain she was out of hearing range did I resume my own movement. This encounter taught me that my journey to the pharmacy was going to take much longer than I'd anticipated. I couldn't afford to rush or take shortcuts if I wanted to avoid detection. The next obstacle I encountered was much more challenging. About halfway to my destination, I reached an intersection where two alleys crossed, creating an open space that I'd have to traverse to continue toward the pharmacy. Using my mirror system, I could see that there were at least 3 infected individuals in the immediate area, and they were positioned in such a way that I couldn't cross without being exposed to at least one of them. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd hoped to avoid, but I'd planned for it nonetheless. I pulled out one of the distraction devices I'd prepared before leaving the clinic, a small electronic timer connected to a buzzer that I'd salvaged from a piece of medical equipment. I set the timer for 5 minutes, then carefully threw the device as far as I could in the opposite direction from where I needed to go. The plan worked perfectly. When the buzzer activated, all 3 infected individuals turned toward the sound and began moving in that direction. This gave me a clear window to cross the intersection and continue toward the pharmacy. But it also confirmed something I'd suspected about infected behavior. They were highly responsive to audio stimuli and would investigate sounds even when there was no immediate visual stimulus associated with them. As I got closer to the pharmacy, I began hearing radio chatter from Jennifer's group through my portable radio. They were reporting increased infected activity in their immediate area, with larger groups forming and moving in coordinated patterns. This was consistent with what I'd observed around my own clinic, and it suggested that the infected were becoming more organized as time passed. Whether this was due to some kind of learning process or simply the result of growing numbers was unclear, but the tactical implications were significant. Jennifer also reported that their water situation had become critical. They were down to less than 6 hours of remaining supply, and one of their group members was showing signs of dehydration. This added urgency to my mission, but it also increased the pressure to succeed. If I couldn't reach them and help them solve their water problem, they might be forced to abandon their secure position and venture out into infected territory on their own. When I finally reached the building that housed the pharmacy, I discovered that the situation was more complex than I'd anticipated. The pharmacy was located on the ground floor of a 3-story building, with residential apartments on the upper floors. Several windows in those apartments showed signs of recent damage, and I could see movement behind some of the intact windows that suggested the building might not be as secure as Jennifer had indicated. I used my radio to contact Jennifer and inform her of my arrival, but I also shared my concerns about the building's security. She confirmed that they'd been hearing movement from the upper floors, but hadn't been able to investigate because they didn't have access to those areas. The pharmacy itself was secure, with reinforced doors and no internal connections to the rest of the building. But the presence of infected individuals in the same structure was obviously a concern. Jennifer guided me to a service entrance on the side of the building that they'd been using for supply runs. The door was hidden behind a dumpster and wasn't visible from the street, which had allowed them to enter and exit without attracting attention. As I approached the entrance, I could hear voices from inside, confirming that I'd reached the right location. The moment I stepped inside the pharmacy, I was struck by how different the environment was from my clinic. Where my refuge had been cramped and improvised, this space was spacious and well organized. The pharmacy occupied most of the ground floor, with high ceilings, good lighting, and multiple rooms that could serve different functions. More importantly, the shelves were stocked with medical supplies that represented a fortune in survival resources. Jennifer Santos was exactly what I'd expected from our radio conversations. Competent, organized, and focused on practical solutions rather than panic or despair. She was in her 30s, with short dark hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she was used to handling stressful situations. The other members of her group were equally impressive. Each of them had adapted to their circumstances and found ways to contribute to the group's survival. The retired electrician, whose name was Frank Kowalski, had rigged emergency lighting throughout the pharmacy using battery-powered systems, and had even managed to get some of the electronic equipment working using portable generators. The college student, Maria, had organized their medical supplies and was serving as the group's medic despite having no formal training. The restaurant cook, David, was managing their food supplies and had improvised cooking facilities using portable stoves. The bus driver, Patricia, was handling security and watch duties. After brief introductions, Jennifer immediately asked me to explain how the solar still would work and what materials we'd need to build it. I spread out the diagrams I'd prepared and walked them through the basic principles of solar water purification. The concept was straightforward enough that everyone could understand it, but the construction would require precision and attention to detail. Fortunately, the pharmacy had most of the materials we'd need. We could use large plastic storage containers for the evaporation chambers, clear plastic sheeting for the condensation surfaces, and dark plastic or metal containers for the heating elements. The key would be positioning everything correctly to maximize solar exposure and optimize the condensation process. But as I was explaining the technical details, Frank made an observation that changed our entire approach to the project. He pointed out that the pharmacy's roof had excellent southern exposure and was easily accessible through an internal staircase. More importantly, the roof was surrounded by a raised parapet that would provide concealment from ground-level observation while we worked on the construction. This was a much better location for the solar still than anything I'd initially envisioned. The roof would maximize solar exposure, provide security from infected interference, and offer excellent visibility for monitoring the surrounding area. We could build a much more efficient system than would be possible at ground level, and we could operate it without attracting unwanted attention. However, Frank also raised a concern that I hadn't fully considered. The building's electrical system had failed when the power grid went down, but the building's water system was still partially functional. The problem wasn't a complete lack of water. It was that the water coming from the taps was contaminated with bacteria and other pollutants that made it unsafe to drink. A properly constructed solar still could purify this contaminated water much more efficiently than trying to extract moisture from the air. This revelation completely changed our resource situation. Instead of being limited to the small amount of bottled water they had remaining, we potentially had access to an unlimited supply of raw material for purification. The solar still wouldn't just solve their immediate water crisis. It would provide a sustainable long-term solution that could support the group indefinitely. We spent the next several hours planning the construction project and gathering the necessary materials. The pharmacy had an impressive selection of containers, tubing, and other supplies that could be adapted for our purposes. We also found several large sheets of clear plastic that had been used for covering displays, which would be perfect for the condensation surfaces. But as we were working on these preparations, Maria made a discovery that created a new and urgent problem. While conducting an inventory of their medical supplies, she'd noticed that one of the group members, David, was showing early symptoms that might indicate infection. He'd been complaining of a headache and slight fever for the past few hours, and she'd found what looked like a small puncture wound on his forearm that he claimed was just a scratch from moving equipment. I examined the wound using a magnifying glass from the pharmacy's optical equipment section, and what I saw confirmed Maria's suspicions. The puncture was clearly a bite mark, probably from human teeth based on the size and spacing of the indentations. More concerning, the tissue around the wound showed the early signs of the characteristic discoloration I'd observed in other infected individuals. This created an impossible situation for the group. David was clearly in the early stages of infection, but he was also one of their most valuable members and a close friend to everyone else. More importantly, he was still rational and functional, not showing any of the aggressive or violent behavior associated with advanced infection. The question was whether we should isolate him, expel him from the group, or try to find some other solution. I shared what I'd learned about the infection process from my radio communications with other survivors and my own observations. The progression from bite to death typically took between 6 and 12 hours, depending on the individual's health and the severity of the wound. Death to reanimation usually occurred within 30 minutes to 2 hours. This meant that David probably had somewhere between 4 and 8 hours before he became a direct threat to the group. Jennifer made the decision that probably saved all our lives. She told David about our discovery and gave him the choice of how to handle the situation. He could leave the group immediately and try to find somewhere isolated to spend his final hours. He could allow us to restrain him in a secure location until the infection ran its course. Or he could help us complete the Solar Still project and then make his final decision based on how he was feeling. David chose to stay and help with the project. He said that if he was going to die anyway, he wanted to do something useful with his remaining time. This decision demonstrated the kind of courage and selflessness that I would see repeatedly among survivors during the early days of the outbreak. People facing impossible circumstances often chose to focus on helping others rather than dwelling on their own fate. We moved the construction project to the roof and began assembling the Solar Still system. David worked alongside the rest of us, showing no signs of the aggression or confusion that would indicate advanced infection. But I could see that the wound on his arm was continuing to change, with the discoloration spreading outward in a pattern that matched what I'd observed in other infected individuals. As we worked, I maintained radio contact with other survivor groups in the area, including Staff Sergeant Williams' group at the sporting goods store. The reports I was receiving painted a picture of a city in complete collapse. The infected population was continuing to grow, and they were becoming more organized in their movements. Several survivor groups had been overrun during the day, and the military safe zone near the Canadian border was reportedly under heavy pressure. Staff Sergeant Williams also shared intelligence that made our timeline more urgent. He'd been monitoring military communications and had learned that federal authorities were considering extreme measures to contain the outbreak. There was serious discussion of establishing a complete quarantine around the affected area, with orders to shoot anyone attempting to leave. If that happened, we'd be trapped in Buffalo indefinitely. This information forced us to reconsider our long-term strategy. The solar still would solve our immediate water problem, but it wouldn't address the larger issue of getting out of the infected zone. We needed to start planning for evacuation, and that would require coordination with other survivor groups and careful timing to avoid military interdiction. But first, we had to deal with David's deteriorating condition. As evening approached, he was clearly struggling to maintain his cognitive functions. He was still helpful and rational, but his movements were becoming less coordinated, and he was having trouble following complex instructions. The infection was progressing exactly as I'd observed in other cases, and we were rapidly approaching the point where he would become dangerous. The solar still was nearly complete, but we wouldn't be able to test its effectiveness until the following morning when we had sufficient sunlight. That meant we'd accomplished our immediate goal, but we still had to survive the night with a group member who was hours away from becoming one of the creatures we'd been trying to avoid. Jennifer made another difficult decision. She asked David to help us secure the building for the night, then retire to an isolated section of the pharmacy where he could be monitored but contained if necessary. It was a compassionate approach that respected his humanity while protecting the rest of the group, but it also meant that we'd be spending the night knowing that death was stalking us from within our own refuge. As darkness fell over Buffalo and the sounds of infected activity increased outside our building, I realized that the next few hours would test everything we'd learned about survival, cooperation, and the moral choices that define who we are when civilization collapses around us. The night that followed was the longest of my life, and it taught me lessons about human nature that I'll carry with me forever. David had accepted his fate with a dignity that humbled all of us, but as the hours passed, we could see the infection taking hold of his body and mind. The wound on his arm had turned a dark purple color, and the discoloration was spreading up toward his shoulder in distinctive patterns that looked like veins filled with ink. By 10 o'clock that evening, David was struggling to speak clearly, and his coordination had deteriorated to the point where he needed help walking to the isolated section of the pharmacy where we'd set up a makeshift quarantine area. Jennifer had found a storage room with a solid door and no windows, and we'd moved some basic supplies in there to make him as comfortable as possible. It was essentially a place for him to die with dignity, away from the rest of the group but not completely alone. What struck me most about David's final hours was how he used them. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or anger, he spent his remaining time sharing information that might help the rest of us survive. He told us about routes through the city that he'd learned during his years as a restaurant cook, making deliveries to suppliers and other businesses. He described buildings that might offer good defensive positions or resources we could use. Most importantly, he warned us about areas where he'd seen large concentrations of infected individuals during his previous supply runs. Around midnight, David asked to speak with me privately. His speech was becoming slurred, and I could see that he was fighting to maintain control of his cognitive functions. He told me that he could feel something changing inside his head, like there was pressure building behind his eyes and a constant buzzing noise that was getting louder. He said it didn't hurt exactly, but it felt wrong, like his brain was being rewired by something he couldn't control. David also shared something that would prove crucial to our later survival efforts. He said that during his years working in restaurants, he'd learned to identify which medications could be used for purposes beyond their intended applications. The pharmacy we were in contained several drugs that could be used to treat pain, infection, or other medical emergencies, but it also contained chemicals that could be used for other purposes. Some could be used to create improvised explosives or incendiary devices. Others could be used as sedatives or stimulants, depending on the dosage and application method. This information represented a significant expansion of our tactical capabilities, but it also raised ethical questions about how far we were willing to go to defend ourselves. David was essentially giving us the knowledge to wage chemical warfare against the infected, but using that knowledge would require us to cross lines that none of us had ever imagined crossing before the outbreak began. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, we heard David call out from the quarantine room. His voice was different, slurred and distorted in a way that made it difficult to understand what he was saying. Jennifer and I approached the door carefully, and through the crack underneath, we could see that he was moving around in patterns that didn't look human anymore. The transformation was happening faster than I'd expected based on my previous observations. We faced a decision that no group of civilians should ever have to make. David was clearly in the final stages of the infection process, but he was still physically contained and wasn't an immediate threat to our safety. We could wait for the transformation to complete itself naturally, or we could take action to end his suffering before he lost his humanity completely. Jennifer made the call. She said that David had been clear about his wishes, and that we owed him the courtesy of not letting him become one of the creatures that had destroyed our world. I won't go into the details of what happened next, but I will say that it was quick, quiet, and conducted with all the dignity we could manage under the circumstances. The loss of David hit the group harder than I'd expected. Even though we'd known this outcome was inevitable from the moment we discovered his bite wound, losing someone who'd been working alongside us just hours earlier brought home the reality of how precarious our situation was. Any of us could be next, and there might not be enough warning or time to prepare for it. But David's death also galvanized our determination to escape Buffalo and reach safety. We couldn't honor his sacrifice by sitting in the pharmacy indefinitely, hoping that someone would come to rescue us. We had to take active steps to save ourselves, and that meant planning for evacuation even though the risks were enormous. The next morning brought both good news and bad news. The good news was that our solar still was working perfectly. The early morning sunlight was generating enough heat to evaporate contaminated water from the building's taps, and the condensation system was producing clean, drinkable water at a rate that would easily meet our daily needs. We'd solved our water crisis permanently, as long as we had access to sunlight and basic maintenance materials. The bad news came through radio communications with other survivor groups. Staff Sergeant Williams reported that his group had been forced to abandon their position at the sporting goods store after being surrounded by a horde of infected individuals that numbered in the hundreds. They'd managed to escape with most of their people and supplies, but they'd lost their secure base and were now operating as a mobile unit with limited resources. Even more concerning, Dr. Sarah Martinez from Buffalo General Hospital had gone silent. Her last transmission had indicated that the hospital was being overrun and that medical personnel were being evacuated to a secondary location, but we hadn't heard from her since yesterday afternoon. The loss of contact with the hospital meant we'd lost our most reliable source of medical intelligence and our best connection to official rescue operations. My brother Michael in Chicago provided the most disturbing news of all. He'd been monitoring federal emergency communications, and the situation was far worse than anything being reported in the mainstream media. The infection had spread to at least 12 major metropolitan areas across the northeastern United States, and the military response was being overwhelmed on multiple fronts. There was serious discussion in Washington about implementing what they called containment protocols, which Michael believed was a euphemism for sealing off infected areas and abandoning everyone inside them. Michael urged me to get out of Buffalo immediately, before the federal authorities had time to implement whatever measures they were planning. He'd also been in contact with refugee organizations operating near the Canadian border, and he'd learned that there was a window of opportunity for evacuees who could reach designated crossing points within the next 48 hours. After that, the border might be closed indefinitely. This information forced us to accelerate our evacuation timeline dramatically. We'd been planning to spend several more days in the pharmacy, gathering supplies and waiting for safer travel conditions. Now we had less than 2 days to organize our departure and make a journey of nearly 40 miles through territory that was heavily infested with infected individuals. Jennifer called a group meeting to discuss our options, and the conversation that followed revealed how much we'd all changed since the outbreak began. 3 days earlier, we'd all been ordinary people living ordinary lives, focused on routine concerns like work schedules and grocery shopping. Now we were calmly discussing tactical considerations for fighting our way through zombie-infested territory, calculating ammunition requirements, and planning supply caches along evacuation routes. Frank, the retired electrician, had been working on modifying vehicles for our escape attempt. He'd identified several cars in the area that could be converted into defensive platforms, with reinforced windows and doors that would protect us from infected attacks while still allowing us to move quickly through the city. He'd also figured out how to modify the engines for quieter operation, which would reduce the noise signature that attracted infected attention. Maria had been preparing medical supplies for the journey, including portable versions of the medications David had identified as having multiple applications. She'd also been studying maps of the area and had identified several potential stopping points where we could rest, resupply, or establish emergency defensive positions if our primary route was blocked. Patricia, the bus driver, had been scouting escape routes using her knowledge of the city's transportation infrastructure. She'd identified back roads and service routes that would allow us to avoid the main highways where abandoned vehicles and infected hordes would make travel impossible. She'd also been monitoring radio traffic from other evacuation attempts, learning from their successes and failures. The plan we developed was complex but realistic. We would travel in 2 vehicles, with enough space for all 5 of us plus essential supplies and equipment. Our route would take us north and east through less populated areas, avoiding the major highways and urban centers where infected concentrations were highest. We'd planned stops at predetermined locations where we could refuel, rest, and assess conditions before continuing. Most importantly, we'd identified multiple fallback positions and alternative routes in case our primary plan was compromised. This redundancy was critical because we knew that conditions were changing rapidly, and flexibility would be essential for survival. We couldn't afford to become locked into a single approach that might prove inadequate when we encountered unexpected obstacles. But as we were finalizing these plans, we received a radio transmission that changed everything. A new voice came over the emergency frequency, identifying himself as Captain Rodriguez from the 82nd Airborne Division. He was coordinating evacuation operations from a temporary base about 20 miles north of Buffalo, and he was calling for any civilian survivors in the area to respond with their locations and status. This was the first official military contact we'd had since the outbreak began, and it represented exactly the kind of rescue opportunity we'd been hoping for. Captain Rodriguez explained that they were conducting helicopter evacuations of survivor groups, but only for the next 18 hours. After that, his unit would be redeploying to other operational areas, and Buffalo would be left to whatever containment measures the federal government decided to implement. The problem was that Captain Rodriguez's evacuation zone was nearly 15 miles from our current location, and getting there would require crossing some of the most dangerous territory in the city. The route would take us directly through downtown Buffalo, where infected populations were at their highest concentration. It would also require us to travel during daylight hours, when infected activity was at its peak, and when we'd be most visible to potential threats. Jennifer made the decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of trying to reach the military evacuation zone, we would stick with our original plan to head for the Canadian border. The military option was tempting, but it required too many assumptions about factors beyond our control. Our own plan was more difficult and dangerous, but it gave us more control over the variables that would determine our success or failure. However, we did modify our timeline to take advantage of the temporary military presence in the area. Captain Rodriguez's operations would draw infected attention toward the downtown area, potentially reducing the threats we'd face on our northern route. If we timed our departure correctly, we might be able to slip out of the city while the infected were distracted by military activity elsewhere. We spent the rest of the day making final preparations for our departure. Frank completed his vehicle modifications, installing reinforced barriers and improved communication equipment. Maria organized our medical supplies and emergency equipment into portable kits that could be quickly transferred between vehicles if necessary. Patricia conducted final route reconnaissance using radio communications with other survivors who were familiar with conditions along our planned path. As for me, I focused on preparing the technical equipment we'd need for the journey. My ham radio setup would be our primary means of communication with other survivor groups and potential rescue operations. I also prepared my optical equipment for use in navigation and reconnaissance, including a telescope I'd assembled from components in the pharmacy's vision care section. But the most important preparation was psychological. We all understood that once we left the pharmacy, we'd be committed to a course of action that would either lead us to safety or result in our deaths. There would be no turning back, no second chances, and no room for hesitation or doubt. We had to be mentally prepared for whatever challenges we'd face during the next 24 hours. As evening approached and our departure time drew closer, I established one final radio contact with my brother Michael. I told him about our evacuation plan and gave him our intended route, in case he could coordinate with refugee organizations to provide assistance at the Canadian border. I also asked him to contact our other family members and let them know what had happened to me, in case our escape attempt failed. Michael's final words to me were simple but profound. He said that the world was changing in ways that none of us could fully understand, and that survival would require adapting to a new reality that had no precedent in human history. He told me to focus on the people who were depending on me, to make decisions based on practical considerations rather than emotional attachments, and to remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of the past to embrace an uncertain future. That night, as we made our final preparations and tried to get some rest before our departure, I reflected on how much my life had changed in just 72 hours. 3 days earlier, I'd been Dr. Vincent Kowalski, a small-town optometrist whose biggest concerns were equipment maintenance and patient scheduling. Now I was a survivor, a radio operator, a group member, and potentially a refugee heading toward an uncertain future in a world that had fundamentally changed. But I'd also learned that the skills and knowledge I'd developed during my professional career were more valuable in this new world than I'd ever imagined. My attention to detail, my steady hands, my understanding of optics and electronics, my medical training, and my methodical approach to problem solving had all contributed to keeping myself and others alive during the most dangerous period of our lives. As dawn broke over Buffalo on our 4th day since the outbreak began, we loaded our vehicles and prepared to leave the pharmacy that had sheltered us during the worst of the crisis. We didn't know what challenges we'd face during our escape attempt, but we were as prepared as we could possibly be. We had supplies, equipment, vehicles, a plan, and most importantly, we had each other. The journey to the Canadian border would test everything we'd learned about survival, cooperation, and the will to live in a world that had become hostile to human existence. But we were no longer the same people who'd been trapped in various buildings when the outbreak began. We'd adapted, learned, and grown stronger. We were ready to fight for our lives and our future, no matter what obstacles stood in our way.